Welcome, everyone. I'm Evan Sandsmark, a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of Virginia, and a member of the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, which is hosting today's film screening and discussion. The event is part of the Informed Perspective series, which brings journalists, documentarians, and humanities scholars into conversation about issues concerning religion, race, and politics. I'd like to thank the Luce ACLS program in Religion, Journalism, and International Affairs for so generously sponsoring this event. In a few moments, we will begin the screening of God in Green in Unholy Alliance. This will be followed by a conversation with our two featured guests, Olúfẹ Táíwò and Katherine Stewart. So a word on them first. Olúfẹ Táíwò is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, contemporary philosophy of language and social science, as well as from histories of activism and activist thinkers. He is currently writing a book entitled Reconsidering Reparations that considers a novel philosophical argument for reparations and explores links with environmental justice. Katherine Stewart is an investigative reporter and author who has covered education, religious liberty, politics, and policy for over a decade. Her latest book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, is a rare look inside the machinery of the movement that brought Donald Trump to power. Stewart's journalism appears in the New York Times, NBC, The Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. And as you'll see shortly, she is also a cast member of today's film. So welcome, Femi and Katherine. I've had a chance to read both your books, which I highly recommend to the audience. The Power Worshippers is currently on sale, and Reconsidering Reparations will be available in fall 2021 or thereabout. So one final note, I want to encourage the audience to raise questions throughout today's event. To do so, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. We'll field some of these questions toward the end of our program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's film. God is Green, an Unholy Alliance tells the story of how potent forces came together to mount an army of climate change skeptics in the name of God, country, and capitalism. The film is directed by Janine Isabel Butler and produced by Catherine Butler, who are the co-founders of Butlerfilms, an award-winning documentary production studio whose work has appeared on PBS, the Discovery Channel, and the BBC. Butlerfilms produced the film for and in collaboration with the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. It's worth noting that the film was made entirely during the pandemic and in a mere 6 months. It was made possible by the generous support of the University of Virginia's Democracy Initiative and the College of Arts and Sciences. You can learn more about the film and access transcripts on our website, religionlab.virginia.edu/godgreen. So don't worry about noting that. We'll give you a link in a follow-up email, so you can look to that if you're interested in more resources. And with that, I want to say, I want to introduce the film, and we hope you enjoy it very much. Thank you.
This is a story about today that started yesterday and impacts tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Nancy Pelosi, lifelong Democrat and Speaker of the House.
And I'm Newt Gingrich, lifelong Republican, and I used to be Speaker.
We don't always see eye to eye.
But we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
Together, we can do this.
We couldn't be further apart. I'm on the left.
And I'm usually right. And we strongly disagree.
Except on one issue. Tell them what it is, Reverend Pat.
That would be our planet. Taking care of it is extremely important.
We all need to work together, liberals and conservatives.
Mark Twain was reported to have said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." In the 1960s, auto and industry pollution got so bad that Republican President Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the Clean Air Act. And then a lot of things happened. Energy wars, culture wars, policy wars, and then came the scientists with proof that the planet is warming. And yet,
is climate change a fact?
No.
No.
No, God can cause a climate.
No.
so the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia asked the question, when did climate change go from a scientific metric to a political hot potato? And what does God have to do with it? Here's what a few people had to say.
Clearly, climate change was identified, culturally marked as a left-right issue. And so I said that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And inasmuch as I represented a very conservative district in South Carolina, that was the end of the inquiry for me.
We have gotten to such a toxic point where we don't even stop to listen to what somebody's saying. Once we know what team they're on, it's like, oh, can't listen to you.
When a conservative says the phrase property rights, what the environmentalist hears is destruction. And when an environmentalist says protect the earth, the conservative Christian hears bureaucracy, regulations. That's why when I embrace creation stewardship as a Christian, people say, well, what happened to you? You know, have you been drinking lefty Kool-Aid?
I earned my spurs for many years as a conservative, a faithful conservative. I came to work for the National Association of Evangelicals that started the religious rights rise in American politics. It was 1980. Ronald Reagan was president. I worked there for a total of 28 years. And so I saw the shift from evangelicals and fundamentalists being not involved in politics, non-engaged, to being hyper-engaged. When I was invited to the climate change conference at Oxford in 2002, I accepted. But I said, don't expect me to change my mind, don't expect me to sign any statements.
But then he came back and he bought a Prius.
The point is, I had a conversion. There's no other way to describe it.
He took the position that the Bible says man must care for the earth. But even worse, he went on NPR and said,
I would willingly say I believe in civil unions.
10 days later, he was fired.
Climate change is not science. It's religion.
We hear that from Christian evangelists even today, that, well, we don't need to listen to scientists on climate. You meld that with a biblical fundamentalism that is a bit rigid, and you have together a noxious brew.
I think that there is an unholy alliance that formed between the leaders of what passed as the moral majority, let's say, and some people with some very specific economic interest when it comes to climate change. When you allow your faith to be used by people with economic interest, wow, does it get corrupted pretty quickly.
For me, one of the starting places has got to be, how did we get ourselves into this mess? We've got to look at our history and understand of how we've gotten here. The racism that has caused some people to be hurt so much more than others.
African Americans in this country breathe air that's 50% more polluted than non-African Americans.
We don't tackle that, we'll just be putting Band-Aids on top of a pussy and ugly wound.
Right at the beginning of environmentalism, let's say the 1960s, evangelicals were okay with it. Even Francis Schaeffer, famous for his anti-abortion crusade, was on board.
One of his first texts is on pollution. Francis Schaeffer comes along and writes this book and says, we are, as evangelicals, concerned about pollution, but we never must lose sight of the Christian roots of our environmental concern, that man needed to be privileged over nature. At this early stage, there was enough synchronicity for evangelicals to support the movement. This changes by the end of the 70s.
The story about how evangelicals came into power is about taxes, actually. Taxes and race. Evangelicals massed behind Bob Jones University when it was pressed to integrate the school and allow interracial dating in the 1970s. When the IRS came after Bob Jones, evangelicals got very upset about this.
Bob Jones University hired lawyers. They took their case to the Supreme Court and said,
all of the policies followed by the university are obligatory upon the university as dictated by Scripture.
The Supreme Court did not agree.
When they had their tax exemption stripped, evangelicals began to write in. They were upset, starting to come into the space of anti-abortion activism and also the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment.
And gay rights, and before long, the planet's rights.
The environment and environmentalism as an ism was understood to be a worldview devoid of God and his creative purposes and his immanence in creation. The solutions put forward by environmentalism were perceived to be a threat or contrary to Christian values.
But there are other issues as well in the 1970s, and I argue that we need to remember them as well.
The energy crisis.
As far as oilmen in the Southwest are concerned, the reason why America is going to suffer in those energy crises is because they have ceded power, ceded control of oil to foreign powers, such as Saudi Arabia, such as OPEC countries.
And so they seized on the phrase, America first. Sound familiar?
America first.
And these independent oilmen of the Southwest wrap all these issues all together and bundle them in, by 1979, an anti-Jimmy Carter, pro-Reagan movement.
Reagan goes on to champion domestic fuel and family values, and wins.
Reagan is defending the rights and the freedoms of independent oilmen across the Southwest to drill, drill, drill.
The fact is, the oil industry has been in an epic battle with itself to control America's political and ideological landscape since oil was first discovered. On one side, Big Oil pushing their brand of American Protestantism,
which I call kind of the civil religion of crude. That is the opposite of wildcat Christianity, the religious, political, economic culture of these small oil producers.
Pushing their brand of evangelical Christianity.
Well, on the civil religion of crude side, we have, of course, one family that absolutely dominates, and it's multiple generations, 4 generations.
The Rockefellers. The oil empire begins with John Sr. in the late 1800s.
By the 1890s, Standard Oil controls upwards of 90% of oil refining around the globe.
By John Jr.'s time, the family is loaded, so he becomes a philanthropist.
Perhaps the leading philanthropist in America at that time.
But a philanthropist pouring profits into the Rockefeller Foundation.
Supporting missionaries, supporting liberal Protestant causes around the globe, extending kind of the Rockefeller vision of ecumenical religion and internationalist, democratic, progressive politics. By the 1970s and 80s, the 4th generation of the Rockefellers have in fact begun to use Rockefeller money to support environmental and other progressive causes around the world. On the other side, there's kind of the wildcat Christianity, rooted again also in the early stages of oil in Pennsylvania, families such as the Stewarts.
The Stewarts of Union Oil poured their profits into evangelizing America.
All the way to his death in the early 1920s, Lyman Stewart will be really the most important, most powerful funder of fundamentalist Christianity, of wildcat Christianity.
Lyman starts a church, funds missionaries, and builds a conservative Christian college.
The notion, too, deeply rooted in the oil patch and in the churches of the oil patch, that oil is God-given. This is a good thing, a divine blessing on America.
The next wildcat oil family to fuel the cause was the Pews.
J. Howard Pew will have his own charitable trust that will be absolutely essential to the rise of evangelical and political conservatism in the 1940s and beyond. Oil is always in motion. You're always chasing the next frontier, be it the untapped soil or unsaved souls. When J. Howard Pew passes away, the mantle is passed to the Hunt family, especially Bunker Hunt, who uses his family's oil money in the late 70s and 1980s to help support several religious right causes.
Evangelicals are very effective in changing the dial politically because they were very media savvy. They knew how to grab a headline. They had networks. There was also oil money being put into some of these organizations,
including the Cornwall Alliance, a group of Christian right theologians and scholars who said, environmentalism is one of the greatest threats to society and the church today.
They tell us that the environmentalist movement is actually unbiblical, and they produced that DVD series, Resisting the Green Dragon, a biblical response to one of the greatest deceptions of our day.
Resisting the Green Dragon cast environmentalism as this threat to the Christian worldview, as an idolatrous worldview that was infiltrating churches and had to be resisted.
The idea is for pastors to create teams of congregants that will, as they describe it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. And then they give them tools to create messaging materials to devote their so-called biblical values.
A lot of folks look at this term dominion that's in Genesis, and basically people have interpreted it that some people have a right to be on top of everything. That's what white supremacy is. The belief you have a God-given, often, right to be on top.
They don't necessarily think about if we're coal mining, that's stripping out the earth, that is making things horrible for people, it's making the environment terrible. They believe God will come down and have this great battle with his angels, renew the earth, beat the devil, and then there will be a new heavens and a new earth.
There's been this tension for centuries between science and religion.
You could go back to the 19th century and begin to talk about how Darwin's theory of evolution really confronted evangelicals.
There were these two major camps within the US church. The modernists, who believed that the teaching of evolution could be consistent with the teachings of the Bible, and the fundamentalists, who said this is a bridge too far. And that kind of culminated in the early 20th century with the Scopes monkey trial. A teacher in Tennessee was taken to trial for teaching evolution.
During this very public trial, William Jennings Bryan famously won the case for the fundamentalists, and the teacher was told to knock it off.
But in the court of public opinion, the fundamentalists were kind of laughed into oblivion. But they didn't disappear. They invested in institutions and have come back in later years in the form of a resurgent modern evangelical movement.
Just imagine if the moral majority had said, you know what, we think God created the earth and it's his, and we're going to dedicate ourselves afresh and anew to taking care of it, which means we're going to start pushing for compost instead of chemicals. And the fact is that factory farming, it pollutes the ground, it disrespects the chicken, it stinks up the neighborhood. Everything about it is terrible, is against being a good neighbor. So we're going to start buying from local farmers. We want to be connected to our food. We want to, you can see the narrative.
You would think that evangelicals would be involved with environmentalism. After all, this is part of God's creation. But for evangelicals, there was a sense in which this whole push for environmentalism was about liberalism.
It just became a tribally marked thing that, liberals are for action on climate. We're conservatives, we don't talk about that. For my first 6 years in Congress, I said that climate change was nonsense. Then I had the opportunity to run for the same seat again, And my son came to me. He said to me, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment."
He went to Antarctica in search of evidence. He found it. And then he went to Australia and witnessed the Great Barrier Reef turning white. Denial was no longer an option.
So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. And it didn't go well at all. After 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote in a Republican runoff, and the other guy got the other 71% of the vote. A rather spectacular faceplant in politics.
I believe Bob was a pioneer and a visionary and a trailblazer. I think his story may have been a cautionary tale when it happened in 2010. I don't think it is anymore.
A lot of those religious right leaders that took exception to my advocacy are gone to meet their creator. And yet there is a whole new generation of the young evangelicals for climate action.
Millennials and Generation Z behind them kind of recognize the danger of marrying their religious commitments with a particular political agenda. They're thinking more deeply about how does my faith inform my politics rather than how does my politics inform my faith.
Young people are rising up and speaking truth and naming what's happening. I think the same thing may happen in greater portion within the church. I think young people are going to rise up calling for something different. I think the original sin was both a violation of the environmental creation, but also a violation of some of the other members of our same species who we did not treat with dignity. If we want to shift, I don't think we can choose either emissions and environmental shift or social justice and relief for the poor. That's one of the things I love about Pope Francis, is that he says these two things, they come from the same root. They must be addressed together.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. Each and every one of us must cherish this planet, for it is likely the only home we will ever know. Combating climate change is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It is the question of preserving this little piece of real estate that we call Earth for generations yet unborn.
Okay, great. I think that wraps up the screening. So we'll wait as everybody rejoins us. Looks like they're there already. So good. So I'll pass it over to Femi first with just a few remarks, prepared remarks, and then we'll move to Katherine. But Femi, why don't you go ahead and take it away, please?
Yeah, thanks, Evan, and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the Center for hosting this. I just want to say a few things to put the US version of the political convergences between religion, ecological crisis, and power in a little bit of a longer historical perspective, just that we have it ready at hand to talk about. So the version of world history that we are living in is markedly different from the vast majority of human history. And the story of how it became so different starts, in my view, around the end of the 15th century. So for much of this millennium, or of that millennium, I suppose I should say, the period of land, the part of land that's now Spain and Portugal would have been referred to as Al-Andalus. It was under control of Muslim powers, and it was reconquered by Christian powers. And it was actually around the same time that Christopher Columbus went sailing for what we now think of as Spain. This kicked off, this voyage and the voyages that followed it kicked off the period of colonialism that created European presence in the Western Hemisphere that was the basis for what is now the United States and the Caribbean nation states and South American nation states. It was Spain and Portugal doing the colonial conquering. And from the very first, the church was involved. In fact, it was the Vatican that negotiated a treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, between Spain and Portugal to divide the Western Hemisphere of the planet in between those powers. As their colonial projects and their European neighbors' colonial projects developed and the nation states got more powerful, there was a shift in politics towards nation states as the kind of most important political entities. They began to outstrip the power of the Vatican. But that wasn't written into the world in 1492. That's something that developed over centuries, decades and decades of time. And it is actually this first century of European colonial imprint in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, that was negotiated by the Vatican. There's actually the first instance of anthropogenic climate change. So many people died in the first century of European colonialism in this hemisphere, mainly from disease, but also from war, conflict, and other forms of death-dealing political practices. So many people died that it actually cooled the earth. And that's something scientists have more or less recently established, but is worth noting as we now confront a climate crisis that threatens to change the world's temperature to an even greater degree. This was corporate, I've said that the Vatican was involved this whole time, but we should also note that corporate entities were involved the whole time. It was the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company that founded Jamestown and what became the United States of America, as England got involved in North America. And so all of these entities, corporations seeking profit, nation states seeking dominion, and religious entities also seeking their own form of control, have been working in concert over the last 5 centuries or so. And there have been shifts in terms of which of these are more dominant. But where we end up in the 20th century is a situation where Reverend Martin Luther King describes 11 a.m. on the Sunday as the most segregated hour in America, because the forms of control over these colonies that were established by the Virginia colony and the Vatican and Spain and Portugal and England, whatever their other differences, were strongly racially organized. And that was how justice, or I suppose injustice, was built into the structure of colonialism and in the structure of power over economies, power over land, and power over people. So from that really long historical perspective, it's really interesting to me and helpful to me that the story of climate crisis in the United States and the way that's been politicized in this documentary starts off with this discussion of, now I'm quoting from the movie, of climate crisis as a tribally marked thing. Right? I think the idea about how we judge information based on who it comes from and how it fits into cultural battles and who we think the information supports, I think is a very deep, basic political problem that we're confronted with in today's day and age, and that is in powerful ways in the film discussed as one of the root problems of climate crisis. And I think religion and economy and race are all big parts of how we stitch together the kinds of tribes that evaluate this information and succeed or fail to respond in positive ways to it. And all of these things, race, religion, corporate power, are powerfully shaped by the actions and impulses and strategies of elites. So the aspect of the film talking about the Rockefellers and the Pews and the Stewarts is, I think, very important to sit next to that thought. In the days of old, it was religion that that was the tool elites used to get regular people to fight crusades, the outcome of which primarily benefited the Ferdinand and Isabellas, the kings and queens of the age, as opposed to regular folks. Nowadays, we have people and corporations like Exxon and organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which writes model legislation that's criminalizing climate protest across the country. But in either case, you have a sort of dedicated strategy by elites to use, whether it's religion or to use, whether it's religion in this more direct way running through the Vatican, or whether to run a kind of pro-corporate politics through a similar veneer of religion, to get people to support criminalizing climate protest and to oppose progressive climate policy. So we have a climate crisis that's much different from the era of the Crusades and the Reconquista, but is not quite as different as it might seem on first blush. And so that's a really long story about the problems and the ways they're similar and different from 5 centuries ago. If there's a lesson in the kind of thing that the film was talking about, I think it's that we should try to develop a politics where we're primarily focused on outcomes, not sides, right? Where we're thinking, what is the world going to be like? How does this different political proposal fit into that or fail to fit into that, as opposed to whether or not a piece of information supports our side, our tribe, our political perspective. And I think we've seen the danger of that antagonistic way of framing politics in the COVID epidemic. The recent study by Northeastern showed that egalitarian global distribution of vaccines would cut death rates by more than twice as much as the unequal rich country centered rollout of vaccine distribution that we've actually gotten. So this way of engaging in politics where we view other people as enemies and try to make everything about winning a sort of antagonistic competition, as opposed to finding more collaborative ways to pursue our own interests alongside and with other people, I think is a kind of chilling version in miniature of the climate crisis. There are attempts to try to fit climate crisis into national security approaches to politics or pro-business approaches to politics, but we need pro-planet, pro-humanity approaches to politics. I mean, much larger and much more collaborative, much more cooperative ways of thinking about addressing these kinds of crises. And unless we can resist the ways that elites try to use religion and charitable trusts and foundations to get us into fighting each other, we're going to be stuck in a bad place. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Femi. Why don't you go ahead and take it away, Katherine, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Femi, for your really thought-provoking commentary. And I want to thank Butlerfilms and the filmmakers, Ashley Duffalo, Evan Sandsmark, everyone else at the University of Virginia's Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab. I'm really honored to join with all of you this afternoon. So I want to make a few points about the history and the alliance between religious fundamentalism and free market fundamentalism, which was so deftly explored in the film. And I also want to briefly summarize how echoes of that science denial affect us in today's climate crisis. So by the 19th century in America, there were already some serious tensions between religion and science. And an early source was actually geology and growing evidence that the earth is really actually quite old. And although the division is really messy, there was a distinct tendency on the part of, I would say, most orthodox, or let's say dogmatic, of the conservative religious clerics to side both against modern science and also to side with slavery, the institution of slavery at the same time. So you find major religious figures like the pro-slavery theologian James Henley Thornwell complaining about, he called it infidel science. And you have the pro-slavery theologian Robert Louis Dabney, who is also with the Southern Presbyterian Church, a Confederate leader. He attacked the physical sciences as so-called theories of unbelief. So whatever their arguments, I think it all boils down to fear. Fear that if people don't accept their reading of scripture as the one true reading, they might start to question the need for submission to their doctrines, for obedience to their clerical representatives. They might start to question the legitimacy of the hierarchies that these ultra-Orthodox theologians were promoting, including racial hierarchies, which they said were ordained by God, and gender hierarchies as well. And they thought that if people start to question those hierarchies, then clearly they will be harder to control, and capital will have a very different arrangement. What makes this rather messy, the sort of alliance between sort of anti-science forces and voices who were in support of racism and slavery, was that in subsequent years, you also had scientists like Louis Agassiz of Harvard, who was profoundly racist and claimed to find support for his racism in science too. And then you had a small but significant number of pro-slavery theorists who believed that science would somehow support them in their as justification for their viewpoint. So the picture is messy, but regardless, hostility to climate action became not just a question of denying the science, but a theological opposition. I would say that most of the sort of science denialist, hyper-conservative theologians of today, who also endorse biblical literalism, the idea of hierarchies as ordained by the Bible, they don't see themselves as opposing science per se. Many of them insist that theirs is the scientific view. So today, when it comes to environmentalism, they believe what passes for science is now deeply infused with a value judgment, and that scientific rhetoric is being deployed to advance the view that humans should subordinate ourselves to nature. They believe this is wrong and specifically unbiblical. In fact, they think it's devil talk, hence the Cornwall Alliance, which we saw in the film. They produce Cornwall Alliance is a sort of a creationist group that produced a TV series called Resisting the Green Dragon, a biblical response to one of the greatest deceptions of our day. And we saw this featured in the film. So they think basically that environmentalism is merely a false moral claim masquerading as science. So, as we saw in the film, again, the Cornwall Alliance has issued declarations saying that as a matter of theology, there's no convincing scientific evidence that human contribution to greenhouse gases is causing dangerous global warming. But here's an interesting thing that goes back to that alliance between the theological opposition and the alliance with sort of a free market fundamentalism. The Cornwall Alliance also says that policies that are intended to slow the pace of climate change represent a, quote, dangerous expansion of government control over private life. So, you know, this isn't the theology of every strand of Christianity, not by a long shot. I mean, most American Christians, including many of the voices that we saw represented in the film, accept climate science and believe in protecting the environment and being good stewards of the environment. But unfortunately, theirs is not the theology that is holding sway in the upper reaches of one of our political parties today. So it is an alliance between a sort of a religious, hyper-Orthodox view and free market fundamentalism. And we want to look at where does the money come from today? Well, if we're talking specifically about the Cornwall Alliance, it was supported early on by the Acton Institute, which is a right-wing free market policy group. The Acton Institute has received a large portion of its funding from the family of the former president's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, and other sort of funders are often, you know, from that sort of representing members of the conservative wings of religious folks. On their website, by the way, Acton takes credit for laying the foundations for gatherings that were later memorialized as the Cornwall Declaration. So this alliance, again, between right-wing religion and climate denial is everywhere. And I want to tell you a little bit about how Christian nationalist leaders spread this alliance. Those leaders know that pastors drive votes. And so they work really hard to organize conservative-leaning or right-wing pastors into networks, and they communicate to them the issues that should matter in election cycles. Climate is one of those issues. It's not the main issue, but if you look at the tools that they are given, you understand why it is one of the tools. And if you look at, you know, how so many of these sort of right-wing pastors come to see environmentalism as a false theology, I just want to give you an example. So here's one of the messaging tools. It's a manual produced in association with the Family Research Council, a leading religious right policy group. And they give this manual to pastors as a tool for turning out their congregations to vote their so-called biblical values. It's got about 150 pages of material. It's actually a very sophisticated document. So they're not just telling pastors and churchgoers to get out and motivate other congregants to vote. They have these really sophisticated tools to do that. So here's what they say about environmentalism and climate science on page 15 and 16. So they have all these resources listed for like pro-life groups, origins. They've got like 3 creationist intelligent design sources for answering issues around the origins of life. There's only one resource listed for environmental issues, and that is the Cornwall Alliance. If you look at the work of some of the most powerful right-wing pastors today, you can see the effect of these types of initiatives in action. I want to just give you another brief example. Let's take Ralph Drollinger. He's founder of Capital Ministries. It's an organization targeting political leaders at the very highest levels of power. Drollinger established a Bible study group in Trump's White House. And he also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate, the House of Representatives, and he also has established Bible study groups in a number of state houses, state capitals. So he's really quite a powerful dude. So every week he produces Bible studies on a different theme. He's not hiding them. You can look up many of them on his website, which is catmin.org. And in February 2018, he had a Bible study that was all about the so-called false religion of radical environmentalism. So referencing the book of Genesis, he said it was unbiblical to think that people can change the environment. The very idea is unbiblical. He called it an ultra hubristic secular worldview. In Dronger's ministry, throughout his teachings, you can see the alliance again with right-wing, sort of far-right libertarian economic positions. A number of his Bible studies are on various points of economic policy where he says the Bible endorses minimal regulation of business, low taxation for the rich, and he is against government funding social services directly. He actually says it's up to the family and the church to meet the needs of the poor, not government or the private sector. So there follows this commitment to an extreme vision of the free market as identical to true Christianity. And these ideas are frankly widespread among throughout right-wing religion today. So, I've probably talked long enough, and I really look forward to engaging in discussion and also to hearing from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katherine. That was great. I particularly like the show and tell of the voter guide. As I was reading your book, I kept trying to envision what exactly these things look like. So that was very helpful. Okay, good. So we'll go through a little discussion ourselves. We do have some good comments coming in. So comments and questions. So I'll try to get to some of those as the discussion goes on. Looks like Femi had to drop off for 1 second. So we can start with you, Katherine. I guess the basic thing I'm thinking about are institutions, the media, universities, courts, churches, and the role they play in the current crisis and the responsibility they bear for it. And you've alluded to some of this a little bit in your own talk. So, I mean, it's fair to say that you don't regard Christian nationalism as a positive development. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe precisely identify who and what is behind it, and if there are any ways that we can try to curb their influence, recognizing it as basically a poisonous influence in a lot of respects.
Sure. I mean, I think when you're looking at the movement overall, it's really helpful to distinguish between the leaders and the rank and file. I mean, regarding their, rank and file, you're talking about a very wide range of people with very different interests and backgrounds and ideas. So the first thing to bear in mind is that a very substantial number of them do not explicitly support anything like a theocracy. Frankly, a lot of them would be unhappy to learn all of the details about what their leaders are proposing. Much of this group votes identity and not just policy. And several of the speakers in the film spoke to this fact very directly. So when they vote for candidates who promise to end abortion, say, or reunite church and state, or insist that America is a Christian nation, they're not really aiming explicitly for major fundamental ways in which the American government is organized. They're kind of making a statement about themselves and what they value in themselves. And their identity, I should say, is really only Christian nationalist in a very loose way. Some of them are concerned about climate issues, but some of them have come to fold in those attitudes toward climate science in with the other aspects of that identity. But I think that really it's about the leaders of the movement, the heads of the religious right policy groups, the networking groups, the media and legislative initiatives, the legal and data organizations and the like. And their vision really involves a lot more power for themselves and their networks and the political leaders that they support. And so, that's really where, if you look at sort of where this is coming from, this is not a movement that is a bottom-up movement. It's not, it's really a top-down movement. Those issues are created not from the sort of rank and file. I mean, you didn't have people all over the country saying, gosh, we're going to deny climate science. Those sort of issues are sort of crafted at the top and then disseminated through their networks. And I also think that, we can't overlook the fact that there is now this sort of a sort of far right propaganda network. We can't overlook the effect of that propaganda sphere in creating a movement that has separated the rank and file from some of the facts. And they do so in these really kind of crude ways. I mean, propaganda outfits don't do subtle. They do black versus white, right versus wrong, impure versus, you're like an insider or you're an outsider. And religion and politics increasingly plays a dividing role, in sort of determining who is, one of us and who is one of them.
Okay, great. And Femi, I see you rejoined, but I just want to follow up real quick with Katherine as you're getting your bearings in the discussion again. So given that there's this distinction between the religious leaders, the ones who are actually driving the movement, and just sort of everyday people who may not be really even aware of some of the dimensions of the movement, I mean, how do you assess the sincerity of these leaders' religious convictions? I mean, when they line up against environmentalism during the Reagan administration, it seems clearly to be for economic and political reasons, as opposed to like trying to view this as the theologically correct thing. And even something that they seem so utterly convinced of, like restricting abortion, is itself something that they did to gain political power, which is something that you detail quite nicely in your book. So I guess to put it sharply, are these leaders cynical, or is that too harsh of a way of reading it? What is your assessment based on your reporting?
Oh, are you asking me or Femi?
Yeah, sorry, Katherine. Yeah. Sorry, I was asking you about the leaders. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Of course, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I mean, if you're, asking whether they're just cynical opportunists or true believers, I would say it's really hard to speculate about the interior states of mind of a fairly large group of individuals. We can't really know what all of them are thinking, but I don't see those two categories as mutually exclusive, really. I'm inclined to believe that for many leaders of the religious right, it is all of the above. I think many of them truly think they have a direct line to God, and I also think that many movement leaders identify their power and money, and the access to money, as evidence of divine favor. And as you mentioned, there are huge amounts of money involved. Many of these leaders can raise significant sums from their audiences and also from sympathetic, wealthy donors. So I leave it to others to judge the extent to whether the availability of this kind of money is going to coexist with perfect purity of motive, we should say.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. A very diplomatic answer. Okay, Femi, I want to loop you back in. So when you cut out, I think I was asking about institutions. So things, media, churches, courts, things of that nature. And I was curious for your take on this, because one point you make in your book, and which you discussed in your opening remarks, is that the problems we face have deep histories and tangled genealogies. And these problems took shape over centuries, and advantages and disadvantages accrued over time. So I guess I'm interested in how this complicates culpability, like who's responsible for this, and if it changes who directly we ask to reform.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think Katherine's answer actually really nicely sets up to the previous question, really nicely sets up the way that I think about this sort of thing, right? Where what's really at issue, we sometimes talk about racism and, forms of bigotry as though they are kinds of defects of character or psychological dispositions that some people have. And there's certainly truth to that, right? There are bigoted people and there are bigoted attitudes, so on and so forth. But, when you're trying to explain, something deeper than the use of a slur, and when you're trying to explain the location of a trash collection service, for example, or a trash incineration service, then you're getting into things like zoning, and you're getting into the extent to which how a congressional district, for example, has been formed over time, and you're getting into issues of disproportionate access to lobbyists and to favor from regulators, and so on and so forth. And it's difficult to tell that much larger, more networked, multi-institutional story in a way that even resembles the way that we talk about individual psychological attitudes, right? Does the comptroller of New York hate Black people? I don't know, but you know, does the way that the institutions that locate trash incineration service respond systematically in ways that are more likely to locate that and other forms of waste near Black communities and less likely to do so to wealthy white communities? That's something I actually do know. There's quite a bit of social science to suggest that sort of thing. And so that massively complicates the story about attribution of blame and responsibility in ways that I think push us up levels of scale. So you know, the accountability story is less about finding an individual person who was exerting bias and more about finding networks of institutional design that work in ways that systematically make some people worse off and other people better off. And you know, that conversation, as I say in the book, looks a lot more like the way that corporate liability gets discussed than the ways that then it resembles the way that individual moral responsibility gets discussed.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So this ties into something else I wanted to ask about to you, Femi, again. So, you know, recognizing this degree of complexity, and this is a question about priorities, about the problems that we should address first. So in a lot of cases, you know, multiple problems will intersect. So if Black Americans breathe 50% worse air than white Americans on average, something mentioned in the film, then a clean air initiative becomes a racial justice initiative. Likewise, if combating climate change is a way to help those in the global South, then climate justice is a type of social justice. But the problem is that objectives don't always so neatly align. And I'm wondering how we should think about prioritization. So should we think about maybe some sort of utilitarian principle, greatest good, greatest number of people, maybe even thinking about future people who don't even yet exist? Or should we try to direct all our energy towards what we identify as the most morally urgent problems, however we define those? So I'm basically just a question about priorities and how we think about them, the hierarchy. For you, Femi, please.
Yeah, I think incentives don't naturally align. And so the question is, you know, rather than a kind of, you know, discovery way of thinking about these things, right? Finding the answer to the principled question of what the justice system really should accomplish or what our laws really should accomplish. I think maybe a different way to think of it is as a design problem, right? So how do we create modes of climate politics that does in fact tie these disparate different interests together? So that's the thing that I like about the kind of scale and ambition of things like what people talk about under a Green New Deal, right? They recognize that there's a variety of things that need to happen to make our economy better and work for more people and prey on fewer people. That's going to involve making sure more people who want them have access to jobs. That's making sure that people have access to housing and making sure that people have access to healthcare and that people retain access to those things in the face of ongoing incoming climate crisis. Those things aren't necessarily, you know, the things that you would do to solve any one of those problems aren't necessarily aligned if you took them separately. But if you bundle them and you say, what we're going to do is the Green New Deal, and by the way, what that means is public housing, retrofitting of existing housing stock to have higher levels of energy efficiency, if it means doing the green goals by doing the social goals, then you have, you know, then you have stitched together these otherwise different interests by a kind of future-oriented plan rather than by some, you know, moral excavation of like what housing justice really means, right? Like we're designing a project. And to me, the way to do that right with respect to these deep questions of inequality, like racial justice and gender justice and disability justice, takes the same principle. Like, how do we design a Green New Deal in a way that addresses the accumulated injustices faced by African-American descendants of those who were enslaved, for example, right? And I think there are good principles that people are trying out, good design principles. For example, identifying census tracts that are disproportionately inhabited by marginalized communities and designating proportions of various kinds of funding associated with environmental justice legislation to go to those tracks as opposed to other ones. I think those kinds of design principles and other ones are, these distributional questions of who takes on the burdens of these transitions and who receives the benefits of these transitions is the right way to think about these deeper questions of justice next to this kind of history.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it, with some good concrete examples that we're contemplating, like the Green New Deal as a society. So Katherine, I'm going to ask you one more question, which is informed by an audience question, but also one that I have somewhat prepared. And then after that, I will try to transition to looking more at the audience questions. But so specifically for you, in the Christian nationalist circles you've studied, I'm just curious to hear broadly, and again, you've touched on this to some extent, how theology intersects with specific policy preferences. So there's this great line in your book that you capture where you quote an evangelical activist who says, "The Bible tells us all we need to know about anything." That's a quote. And then early in the film at the Republican Senate.
I'm so sorry, Evan, I think you've frozen.
Oh, can you hear me again?
That's better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, what, so yeah, sorry. Is it okay now or?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
No worries. Thanks for letting me know. So just, I guess to sum it up, and the question from the audience was related, is how do you see the connection between religion and politics, and which way do you think the causality runs? Do you think it's theology driving politics, or do you think it's the other way around in general?
Oh, wow, that's a great question, and a pretty broad one too. I think that in general, it's the sort of, look, people interpret the Bible so many different ways. There were pro-slavery theologians and there were abolitionist theologians. I write about a dozen of them in my book, Power Worshippers, and the sort of tension between the two. And you can see that religion, the same text can be interpreted in so many different ways. There has to be something besides just the religion determining these vastly, different and opposite positions. But, it's interesting when you talk about how embedded is theology in some of these positions, specifically related to climate denial. Let's look at the Cornwall Alliance again. It's founded by, a key founder is a fellow named E. Calvin Beisner. He, before he founded Cornwall, he was a co-founder of something called the Coalition on Revival. It's a very large network of right-wing and evangelical Christian leaders and theologians, and they gather every few years in a different locale. And Coalition on Revival members espouse a variety of theologies, but all of them incredibly hyper-conservative, I would say radical, actually. They've adopted explicitly dominionist and reconstructionist ideological positions. The idea that Christians of a certain kind, not progressive Christians or moderates, but people who sort of agree with their interpretation of the faith, should dominate all aspects of government and society. And Beisner was actually an early co-author of those position papers. So when you go back and look at a lot of the organizations that now form part of the infrastructure of today's Christian right. You can see the radical roots in them among, a number of the leaders. A lot of times they'll, talk about something and it sort of becomes adopted as like, they say things like, the First Amendment was supposed to keep, the interference of government out of religion and rather than separation of church and state. Well, this is a sort of idea that was articulated by one of the founders of modern Christian Reconstructionism, a fellow named Rusas John Rushdoony. So, but then you hear like little bits and pieces of his very extremist theology everywhere. The historian Julie Ingersoll has written a wonderful book about that. And Anthea Butler has also, who's also in the film, has written about that. So when you hear some of the leaders of the religious right speaking today, you can hear echoes of the past. And if you dig a little bit deeper, you see the radicalism at the core of their ideas. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much. So yeah, lots of questions from the audience. Let me try to get to a couple of those. Some of them are a little lengthy, but maybe this one. So this is the top voted one from Manuel Lerdow. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. An ecologist in environmental science department, is teaching agroecology this semester. And so several of the people in the film linked fighting for the environment with fighting against racism. So Joel Salatin, I'm not sure that he was the man in the film, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, is seen in the movie decrying anti-environmentalism, also denies the existence of systematic racism in America, and has come out with some straight up racist comments himself. What should we do? What should we who care about racial justice, what should we do when we care about racial justice, when we are wearing our environmentalist hats, do with the Salantises of our movement? So basically, he's good in one area, bad in another. How should we assess those characters? Femi, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a couple things. Yeah, I mean that's a tough. I'm not quite sure what to make of those characters, other than just to lean on the kind of thing I was saying earlier. I mean, ultimately, what matters, from my perspective, I'm kind of laser focused on the sort of material outcomes. So where are the trash compactors and the trash incinerators, right? Where are the solar panels? Are the buildings retrofitted? I think, one strength of the right, as the film explains and as Katherine's book very strongly explains, is their willingness and ability to organize around, what people might call practical unity, to have practical unity, to agree on what to do, and to be able to kind of let ideological disagreements kind of lie, right? A lot of these people have, a lot of these coalitions on the right are not politically coherent if it's ideology you're looking at, right? But they realize that, what's important is for them dominion, right? And they can get it without agreement on these deep ideological questions. And I think for us, for people on the other side of that battle, I think what needs to be important for us is justice, and in this kind of real, material, concrete, practical sense. We need to be a little more ruthless and a little less moralistic about what kinds of disagreements we countenance in the service of that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as you put it earlier, outcomes, not sides. So ruthlessly trained on the effects. Yep. So Katherine, did you want to weigh in on that at all? If not, I can dip into the question pool, but it's up to you.
Absolutely. Look, I think the challenges we face are political, and I think a lot of the solutions are going to be political too. We can't get any policy pushed forward unless we have political consensus and the ability to do that. And I think, whatever people's, personal opinions, the fact is, a lot of the movement that the religious right is, the racism is really very structural, because it pushes support for a political party that has made race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression a strategic imperative. And I think another problem that we're facing, one of the consequences of that race-based gerrymandering is that in a lot of Republican districts, they're not running in state races, they're not running against Democrats, they're running against fellow Republicans. And so the way they tend to win is to run to the right of other Republicans and say, well, that person says they're a conservative, but I'm a true conservative. They say they're against, they're not a pure conservative, I'm the best, most conservative. And so then you end up with a really distorted, frankly, distorted political party. And I think, as we saw in the beginning of the film, in an earlier era, you had Democrats and Republicans who might take different positions on a lot of issues, but there was more likelihood of creating climate consensus because there was just more moderation. There was just a sort of, the party hadn't been sort of taken off into this sort of frankly radical direction. So I think that, frankly, protecting voting rights, which now there's this massive assault on voting rights, which is very race targeted and very racist, protecting voting rights, which, this is something that all Americans should embrace. It's the most patriotic thing we can do, is to protect the right to vote and the right of political representation.
Yeah, amen. Okay, so I think we're virtually out of time. I was going to possibly try to get to the audience questions, but I think they might just be slightly more complex. So what I want to do instead is perhaps ask very briefly, starting with you, Femi, and then with you, Katherine, if you're hopeful about the future, and do you think we can actually address these challenges? Maybe just a minute for you, Femi, a minute for you, Katherine, and then I'll wrap us up.
Hopeful is not the word that I would use, but there are two things I would say. The first is that there's a perspective that avoids despair that is achieved when you've decided to do something, right? When you've decided to fight, when you've decided to struggle, it just rules out a kind of hopelessness. That doesn't mean that you're sure you're going to win or that everything's going to go okay, but it you no longer feel helpless or passive. And so I think in making this something that I do, I've avoided a kind of despair, and I'm encouraged, at least, by, I think, a serious reckoning historically with the intellectual and political tradition that I identify with, the Black political tradition. For much of recent human history, things have been worse for us than they are now. And we're still here. And so I think that also helps stave off a certain kind of hopelessness. And so, I think that's the best I can do on that question.
No, I'll take it. That's good. Katherine, how about you?
Femi, that's great. And I've got nothing original to say, so I will paraphrase Stacey Abrams. I am neither hopeful nor pessimistic. I am determined.
Wonderful. That's a good line to end on. So with that, let me close this out. So thank you so much to both Olúfẹ Táíwò and Katherine Stewart for the reflections on the film, for engaging in dialogue, and for answering my questions and audience questions. So as a reminder, a recording of today's event will be published on religionlab.virginia.edu, and we'll notify all attendees when that's available. We also invite you to attend the next Informed Perspectives webinar on March 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time about race and religion in China. So thank you everyone for being here today. We hope many of you will join us again for future events. Thank you.